How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com. Hey, guess what? It's .NET Rocks again. I'm Carl Franklin.
And I'm Richard Campbell.
And here we are. Sarah Novotny is here. We're going to be talking about sustainable open source with her. But just briefly, man, what's up? How you doing, Richard?
I have successfully migrated off of LastPass and over to Bitwarden.
Yes, very good. We heard that.
And I got the wife to go too. Not a trivial problem, you know.
Right.
But she was on board, and I deleted the account today. So,
and it was a good experience for you?
Yeah, Bitwarden has good import for LastPass stuff. It was an opportunity to reorganize. When you export from LastPass, you're literally going to get a CSV file. So that's all your passwords, dudes. Like, look out.
Right.
Delete that file. But I was also able to open it up, pull some stuff apart, separate out what I wanted in the shared accounts versus my personal. And all in all, the vaults are better for the move.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I'm still up in the air if I should go to that one or 1Password.
You'd be fine either way. In the end, I mean, we can debate how badly LastPass has actually made our data in danger, but their irresponsibility,
bad enough,
needs to be acknowledged. And the fact that they've changed ownership a bunch of times, like whoever owns it right now, they need to be made aware. And there's no other better way to vote than with your money.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
Close that account, cut them off from the money.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we've talked about that at security this week too.
Sure.
And at first we were kind of like, they didn't get all the passwords. It's okay. You're probably safe. And then just this repeated barrage of irresponsible moves.
Yeah.
That's enough.
There's only so much. And honestly, like, not only was my experience relatively painless, and I'm fortunate to be married to a woman who takes this stuff seriously too, and so she was on board even though it was a pain, but the opportunity to tidy up, the obligation to migrate also meant an opportunity to junk some accounts, make sure we've got the right things consolidated, get rid of some duplicates, like a little hour-long bit, a couple hours of housekeeping. Good. Yeah,
it's almost spring cleaning. But not quite.
It's a little optimistic in January, but okay.
Winter cleaning.
I mean, it's not like we had winter back in November, right? Like we're really not having winter in the Pacific Northwest right now.
Very strange.
It's pretty weird.
All right. Well, let's get this party started with a little thing that we call Better Know a Framework.
Awesome. All right, man, what do you got?
This is just a news story. It's on The Verge.
Yep.
And it's about, the latest saga in AI, copyright violations and those kinds of things. Getty Images is suing the creators of AI art tool Stable Diffusion for scraping its content. So Getty Images is a stock footage, a stock photo place.
And also famously litigious.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so, you have to pay for images when you go to Getty Images, and that's their business model. And apparently this Stable Diffusion AI art tool that generates images based on your descriptions was scraping them. And how do they know? Because an image a generated image came up with the Getty Images logo on it.
And we heard this over and over again, but a lot of this generated art that you kept seeing the artist signatures and things in there.
Right.
But you also can imagine, if you're in the machine learning space, you don't think about the fact that your training data may be revealed in the operating model.
Right.
So, you're thinking, I can use copyrighted information in the training model because I'm not actually going to use it in the wild. It's like, you are mistaken. You cannot use copyrighted material without permission. Full stop.
Full stop. Yeah.
And Getty Images is apparently going to make that painfully obvious.
Yes. So, this is an ongoing conversation. I've invited some other people that have ideas about this to come on .NET Rocks and talk to us about it, because it's not just a tech issue. It's a legal issue and it's a moral issue, isn't it? I mean, There's just a whole bunch of stuff around AI that we're bumping up against. Finally, after all these years, we have a reason to think twice about it.
And in some ways, these tools are doing us a service by forcing us to think clearly about this.
Yes, that is a great way to look at it.
Whether or not it actually needs to be litigated is another question entirely, but I suspect Getty Images is not going to let go easily.
Probably
That's not their style.
Right.
Good one, dude.
Yeah, thanks. So who's talking to us, Richard?
Grabbed a comment off of show 1818, the one we did back in, I think it was actually in October in Oslo, although we published in November when we talked to David Whitney about making open source working for everyone.
Right.
Lots of comments on that show, including the fact that I think there was a bit too much cursing in that show. We apologize for that.
Well, it was all bleeped, I think.
It was also in the evening in Oslo. I believe there was beer involved.
Yeah, I think there was. And he dropped the first F-bomb, and we were just like, okay, we're playing along.
We're playing that game, man. There's no two ways about it. But all fine. Again, bunch of great comments. And this particular comment comes from Joe Finney. And you may know that name because Joe Finney makes some cool apps. And I'll include a link to his website for a bunch of nifty open source projects that Joe makes. Okay. Joe says, I think the question of how to make open source work for everyone is a big question that will only get bigger as time goes on. Maybe a question for every guest could be, what open source projects do you support? And how do you support them?
Yeah.
That question helps people in similar situations understand that they should be paying for software that makes them money. Also, maybe start calling out some big businesses that are enjoying the benefits of open source projects without contributing or supporting the developers that are doing the work. Right. When a business grows to a certain size, it really should have an open source fund. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with anything with you, Joe, and you do good work, friend. Thank you so much. I think probably time to have you on the podcast a little, having a chat.
Yeah.
And of course, a copy of Music to Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music to Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and we read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music to Code By.
And definitely follow us on Mastodon. I'm at Carl Franklin at techhub.social, and he's at Rich Campbell at mastodon.social. Send us a toot, tooty, toot, toot, Rudy, toot, toot.
What was that?
I don't know. I just don't have any jokes. Send us a tweet. We kind of had the run of jokes, and I just kind of got dry, and then you were making them up, and now we're on Mastodon, and I don't know. It just doesn't have the same sense of humor, I think.
And yet it's funnier at the same time.
Yeah, all we got to do is say toot. All right. So anyway, let's bring on Sarah. Sarah Novotny has long been an open source champion in projects such as Kubernetes, Nginx, and MySQL. She's part of the Microsoft Azure Office of the CTO. She sits on the Linux Foundation Board of Directors, previously led an open source strategy group at Google, and ran large-scale technology infrastructures before WebScale had a name. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm happy to join you all.
Oh, there's so much to talk about.
No kidding.
Where do we start?
Open source sustainability is a huge space.
Well, plus you come from the broader open source world. How did you end up at Microsoft?
That is a fun story because I lived in Seattle for 20 years and moved away from Seattle, all without working for Microsoft, before I actually decided to come work for Microsoft.
Interesting.
And ultimately, after my time at Google, I realized that some of the spaces that were the biggest change was necessary were in large-scale enterprises to understand and explain and work with the fact that open source is a tool in our industry and we make use of it, but it's in like 96% of all proprietary software at this point.
Right.
And when you build something new today, it's about 80% open source dependencies, whether that's your math library or your standard out libraries or, pulling in NPM dependencies or jar files or whatever. It almost doesn't matter at this point what language you're using. You're pulling in a lot of open source as you're building it. So
as to the listener's comments, to Joe's comment, pretty much if you're making money from software, you should have an open source contribution strategy. Full stop.
You should understand that you are only able to move this fast because you're using the building blocks of open source. And, unless you are a single developer or, just a couple of people, in my opinion, you should be contributing to things that you're dependent on. And even as a single developer, you get to guide your own future by helping contribute.
There's lots of different ways to contribute too. We're not just talking about cutting a check, which I think the fewest people do. Like, I really appreciate the original sort of open source model when it was developers with developers primarily, where it's like, hey, I built this tool to help me. Maybe it'll help you. And it's like, hey, it's helping me too, but I need this capability. Let me contribute it. And then you
let me scratch my own itch.
Yeah. And then it'll help others. Like, that is sustainable in its own way. Although some projects are pretty tough to penetrate, to get involved in. Like, they get complicated and big.
Yeah. Well, there's a number of ways they get harder to contribute to. One, they become a larger dependency for more places. So something like OpenSSL is a great example that it should be pretty hard to contribute. You should have to commit a large amount of time and, plan to work on it upstream as long as, in order to make this important. It's also a very specialized skill with crypto, for example.
Yeah.
So there are some places where it makes perfect sense. It's a huge dependency pattern, or it's, a specialty skill. There's other places where it's become so popular that lots of people want to work on it. And it's sort of that success disaster, where you've got so many people wanting to come help that what you need to be doing is building on-ramps for your contributors and trying to guide them, which you don't generally think of as an open source need, because it's usually sort of small and scrappy and cheap and cheerful, as opposed to giant and well supported by large companies. Kubernetes being an example there.
Right.
I've known folks who said, like, one of my bucket list items is to have a pull request accepted by Linus Torvalds into the kernel. Yeah. Right. Which is like A, weird bucket list item, but B, totally get it. Also, terrible motivation for contributing code. Like, you would want it to be meaningful, like it should be good code and so forth. Yeah. But I would imagine there are folks that want to think that same way about C# or .NET now that they're all open source projects. Like, you could have a piece of code that everybody that uses .NET consumes.
Well, here we were just talking about a really relevant open source project that makes us think about it before using it, and that's Bitwarden. It's all open source, and yet it's a password manager, right? And so our first reaction is, oh, I'm not going to use that. Everybody knows the code. Is there any justification for that kind of fear?
No, not in my opinion. I believe that more people seeing things mean a couple of things. One, all bugs become shallow. You can find and fix things more easily. But you can find things more easily, because if you have more people looking at the code and it's more public, you can find it and have it remediated. All code has. I guess
I'm not worried about that. What my fear is that, the nefarious hackers are going to look at the code and find an exploit before somebody, a good guy finds the exploit.
Yep. That is why we hope to be publishing, or why we are publishing publicly, with the expectation that we're all working through multiple code reviews, through deep engagement with these projects to make sure that they are as secure as other software. I mean, yes, there is a first view ability, but you're also now talking about security through obscurity, which we all know is not an awesome solution.
Well, it's a spectrum, isn't it? On one hand, you have security through complete obscurity. On the other hand, you have complete openness. And at some point in there, somebody gets an advantage.
I just think there's more good guys than there are bad guys.
Yeah, I don't know
this is our hope.
I'm not saying that the fear is justified at all. I'm just wondering, if a guy like Patrick Hines, who I've been talking to about Bitwarden, who's a security expert, says, not crazy about the fact it's open source, it gives me pause.
Yeah.
So here's another potential, because I have not looked at Bitwarden recently. If I remember, it's not a service at this point either. You only collect it. You only have it instantiated locally.
That's
You're
right.
running it.
There is a service model now.
There is a service model now.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, for the server part of it.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, anytime you have access to a computer, there is risk with it.
Sure.
I think that is one of the challenges we have when we as enterprises look at open source as free like sunshine, not free like a puppy. because free like a
Puppies aren't
puppy
free.
is the model. Puppies are not free. And I have a great image that I splash up in front of audiences all the time of this very, cute dog with its sort of cocked head one side, just going like, what are you so upset about, with an absolutely trashed door behind it? And I'm like, this is how puppies are free. And this is how your software is free.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that it is inherently bad. It's to say that it is a thing that you have to evaluate risk on. Software of any kind. And your password keeper is a perfect example of this, because we have to evaluate the risk of, do I want to store this with a third party? Do I trust that third party through a service? Maybe, maybe not. Do I only trust a first party? Do I trust this software that is downloaded from the internet, which most software is today? Great. Okay, so now I've downloaded Bitwarden, but I didn't compile it. Okay, but I didn't compile the 1Password or LastPass binary either. We could go back to Ken Thompson's article on trust from, I want to say it was like the 90s. Might even have been earlier than that.
We talk about the 90s like adults talked about the 60s when I was a kid.
Pretty much.
Or the 50s even. Anyway.
Yeah, Trusting Trust was the name of the paper, and it is 1983 ACM speech.
Wow.
So, how do you ever trust a binary? Like, we have to just evaluate these risks and make trade-offs based on
reasonable.
Our ability. Yeah.
Right.
Our best ability to be able to remediate the risks, our best abilities to mitigate the outcome of the risks. Like,
Well, that's where I think you argue in favor of open source. Is a closed source bug more likely to be fixed than an open source bug?
I don't know that we have statistics.
Yeah. Well, because the closed source folks tend not to advertise. Right. So I would argue more eyes increase the likelihood of fixing bugs.
That it will be fixed. Agreed. It also means, though, that it's more likely that they will be discovered. And so that the more eyes discovering more bugs is something that sort of skews the way it's reported. And so, there's, are you able to manage all the updates from the piece of open source that you're dependent on in a meaningful and timely way? Like, as you're developing other code for your own customers, like, can you take new dependencies when they change? How well are you established to manage that if you're a developer?
Yeah. Valid points. You come with an outside perspective. Mm-hmm. How well is Microsoft doing open source? I mean, clearly they moved full force, at least on the .NET side, and this is a .NET show. But, you've seen other kinds of open source work done in large organizations. Mm-hmm.
I use a William Gibson quote here a lot. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So in this case,
one of my favorites.
It's such a great quote. In this case, open source is here at Microsoft. It's just not evenly distributed.
True.
I would also say that we have to sort of pull apart open source consumption. So using it as a building block in the tools that we build. Microsoft does that all over the place, doesn't always even recognize, like, your average developer doesn't think about that necessarily as open source. It's a smooth process. It's just a piece of what they develop with. It's great. So there's consumption. There's contribution. So there's working upstream in someone else's project that you may be dependent on. I don't think we do a great job of that. I don't think Microsoft does a great job of that yet. We're still working on it, and that's something that I've been spending a lot of time internally trying to advocate for. This is a cost of business. These are components that you are pulling into your proprietary software product. So you should have some cost associated with that. Again, not free like a sunshine, free like a puppy.
Right.
And then there's creation of software, which is very different. And so you've got more of the VS Code and .NET Core spaces there. And then once you get to creating open source, you've sort of got multiple types there. You've got the, we're not using this anymore. We're chucking it over the wall. Good luck. Hope you enjoy it.
Abandonware.
Abandonware. Yep.
And Microsoft says they won't do that. And then I look at WinJS and I'm like, think you did it.
We try not to, and we try very hard to educate product teams when they say, "Oh, we're not going to fund this anymore. We'll make it open source." We're like, that doesn't get you anything.
Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, it could be a detriment. So we try really hard to stop that sort of open sourcing. The community will take care of it now. No, not. There is no community until you build a community.
Right.
So we've got that sort of creation of open source. We've got sort of the nostalgiaware, which we're seeing Microsoft do a little bit more of, which is we haven't shipped this in 10 years, and we don't even know if it still builds on our infrastructure, much less somebody else's. But here's the code, go play. Which is cute, which is a lot of fun and brings back some of the fun old tools that used to exist in Windows, for example. So we see that happen. Then there's also the purpose-built sort of, we think that this is important, but we don't think this piece of software is going to be the differentiator. So we have some work going on right now where we are making sure that we are developing a community around the software ecosystem, because we think that the specialty knowledge necessary to work on the open source project is going to be very small. So you want to make the thing that we open source useful. We'll take contributions. We just don't necessarily think a lot of people will want to have that depth or skill set. We'd rather you play with it and make contributions around it. So we're looking at things that way. We also have things like a .NET Core and VS Code who were purpose built to be open source and then potentially show the lighter weight, sort of the open core model of open source, where, VS Code is lightweight, and if you are a .NET developer, going to Visual Studio actually gets you a lot more feature set. So you've got a lightweight thing that's sort of the starter open piece, but then you can go on to a more robust proprietary piece.
Not that there's any lineage there. The only thing in common between VS Code and VS Studio is the VS part.
The font.
Right? Okay, one is an editor, and it's got an approach to IntelliSense that's completely different from the editor inside of Studio that also has IntelliSense.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about the project and the product as they exist to differentiate them. I'm not someone who has ever used Visual Studio as a day-to-day thing, and I've only used VS Code a little bit.
And it's an editor where an integrated development environment is a just totally different creature.
Yeah.
For better or worse. And I use both, for a reason.
Do you use Visual Studio to code in languages like your Python is you'd go there to build Python stuff as well?
I haven't. I know I could. When I write Python, I write it in code.
Yeah.
Right. Really. But that's also because most workflows that you learn Python from don't think in context of Studio. They think in context of use your favorite editor.
Right.
That might be Vim or a dozen other things, Emacs or code, and then you go from there, because that's what the educational material represents, right?
Yeah.
But when I build stuff in Azure, when I work on my websites, when I work on those kinds of things, I do it from Studio. Because that's what I know.
Because it makes the pipeline clean. Yeah.
Yeah. Now all the pieces I need are there, right? I don't have to assemble my own tool chain for that.
Yep. Which goes back to open source is a lot of building blocks. I mean, much of it comes from the more Unix mindset of small, discrete tools that can be chained together to give us an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how you like that tooling. And in some ways, I think it's one of the challenges that enter into those things. Like, what's nice about Studio when you're teaching someone development is they all have the same tool set, to start with. They can do some customizations, but you start with a base template that includes a debugger and a deployment engine, and all of those things are kind of there. So let's walk you through building something. They're very different philosophies. I'd like to jump back to the contribution side of Microsoft, because I look at a project like Chromium. So now we're talking two tech giants, Google and Microsoft, both contributing to project. Like, that's, to me, seems like that would work a charm.
It's a great tool set. It's a great piece of software. It is underlying both Chrome and Edge at this point. And I think it probably underlies several other things, but I'm not going to be able to be confirmed off the top of my head. It works well. Now, this goes to one of the things that we talked about a moment ago, which is the projects that come out of big companies. So, for example, Chromium came out of Google first, and it is still very strongly led by Google. Whereas as a different type of project that can do different things strategically, Kubernetes also came out of Google and is now community led, which makes for a very different experience and ability to engage with the project. So you end up with these different ways to engage with them that are all about the governance of the project. And those that are company led, so VS Code, .NET, Chromium in this case, those that are much more company led, have a higher bar of entry to contribute to that core set of tech.
Right.
And usually have something that is a formal contribution path so that you show up and you're a junior dev the first day and you might put in some stuff and you put in a little bit of time and you make some good commits and then you might be moved up to, something that is more of a contributor as opposed to, and then eventually you can grow into maintainer roles. But that sort of progression is very different in a company-led project than it is in a community-led project.
Because Chromium, there's only a handful of developers that are going to use Chromium. It's people who build browsers, right? And I just double checked the list and it's like Opera uses it. Samsung Internet uses Edge, obviously. So as opposed to Kubernetes, where I think Kubernetes being implemented on Google, Azure, and AWS made it wildly more valuable. It became the de facto orchestration engine because everybody had it. And that the big players had it. And that helped build an ecosystem around it, the Helms and so forth. Like there was a time when you debated orchestration engines. These days, that's pretty hard to do.
2013 was the last time most of us did.
DCOS, Swarm.
Here's a good one that started at Google, gRPC, right?
Yep.
gRPC.
Still very project or very company led, part of the CNCF now. Yep.
Right, but everybody uses it, and the way it's architected is it's a framework that gets implemented on all these platforms. So, but that's a perfect example. And you might think that the G stands for Google. Maybe it did one day, but if you actually look at gRPC.io, it says gRPC stands for gRPC Remote Procedure Calls, of course.
Because that's the funniest way to name it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to interrupt for one moment for this very important message. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Richard Campbell. That's Carl Franklin.
Yo.
Talking to Sarah Novotny of the Office of the CTO. Such a title. Such a title. And I want to continue the thread we had just before the break. We were talking about, Microsoft contributed to Chromium, where it's a big company working with a big company project. Where I think this gets more challenging, I mean, in the case of Chromium, that's generally all FTEs. Like they're employees of Google working on Chromium. They're employees of Microsoft working on Chromium. But when I think about more traditional open source, so I think of a Jimmy Bogart, like a famous open source name in the .NET circle, and with AutoMapper, here's a person who, that very traditional, I built a tool to help me on my projects. I published it in a way so that other people could work on it too and be helped out. And then it becomes valuable. And I don't think that's happened to AutoMapper, so that's not a good example in that respect. But suddenly Microsoft's using it. They feel like they should contribute to it. And you put an FTE on it. Like the idea that an employee is now working on that effectively for pay. This is now my job. I think is a very different dynamic from the volunteer dynamic that we think of in sort of traditional open source.
I agree. As is the sort of tin cupping and buy me coffee sponsorship levels that we're seeing more and more and more.
And I want to dive into that. Like, I think that's hugely important too. Like maybe the better answer is let me make a contribution as opposed to bringing a developer in. Just because of that, there's an interesting power disbalance there. It's like that person's got 40 hours a week in theory to put onto that, where no volunteer contributor does that kind of time.
There's interesting different ways that these things move. A lot of times those accidentally famous NPM modules are a single developer doing a thing and are, dozens of lines of code, not hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands.
Right.
So I think there's a mix of this. We have very few send mails today where, it was developed, it was sort of worked on collaboratively. A couple of labs had people who were working on it full time, but not really. It was sort of, byproduct of other work. But we tend to have lots and lots of very small projects, some mid-sized framework projects. There are several that are still very community-run. Node.js is a great example of a very community-run, mid to large-sized project, definitely at the larger end, but not one that is company-controlled or that people are primarily spending their full day job time on. So there are more of those these days.
I mean, you still have the Ryan Dahls and Brian Candrels of the world, right? Like
you do, but they're also not they're not like day-to-day contributing to Node.
Right.
They're doing their other things these days. So it's a mix, and it has always been a mix. It's been more of a mix with research than with corporations. But since OpenStack, we've had a lot of, our problems are bigger and different and more distributed. We need to make bigger and different projects in order to do this. So we end up in a space where Linux being obviously one of the big examples,
sure,
but we make these much bigger projects where we need more of the industry to align and work together on something full time because we believe that it is becoming commoditized even within the whole of the industry. And there's no value in all of us doing it independently. I am very much a pragmatist about open source. There are engineering economics that get you there. There are, great ways to run communities that make them more equitable and inclusive of people who have not come from exactly the same background as everyone else. But there are lots of ways that you can do this. So I'm a huge fan of this bigger picture alternative to straight up corporate open source projects, which is why I led the transition for Kubernetes from company led to community led. I felt that would move the industry more than another project from Google.
Right.
I mean, and yet it doesn't make sense for Chromium, or does it make sense?
Not particularly. Again, because of the consumer. The consumer of Chromium is building and producing more software.
Yeah.
Which is a very specific piece of software.
Yeah.
The consumer of Kubernetes is running anything infrastructure these days.
Yeah, it's running, like I said, it's very open stack. It's running on their on premises. It's available in all of their clouds. So that makes more sense. I think the context of how that code runs is wildly important. Node.js is another good example. Should be community led because a huge array of developers are going to work against it. And so consensus minded is more likely to benefit the majority of them.
Yep.
Where I think you can still round up most browser developers, the people who would build a browser, in a meeting room. And where you couldn't do that for a lot of these other stacks. So I mean, certainly
probably
not
a big meeting room, all hands, big meeting room. But but we're still talking about hundreds globally, not hundreds of thousands globally.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important match there. That you are talking about how the software is ultimately going to be used.
Well, and this is a great differentiator between why so much infrastructure software is open source and why so little end user consumer software is open source.
Yeah.
Even when Android is open source, what the people who are running Android phones are doing with it is not contributing upstream to Android or even to the Android applications primarily.
Yeah, you won't see the Samsung stuff in open source.
Yeah.
So what about tin cupping? Does this make sense? And how do we divvy it up?
What does that mean, Richard? Begging,
going around and asking for small amounts of money from everyone that you're interacting with. I think companies having more focused sponsorship programs attending to their dependencies is very important. Now, that sponsorship can be time, it can be money, it can be, integrations to other things. It could be any of the things we do in networking in the sort of social sense for a developer who is creating an open source project. They'll come to you or me and say, hey, do you have a connection to here? I need to, I need to make a change. So helping people with connections, helping people with money, helping people with full-time engineers is also, they're all great. But
all
again,
reasonable.
But it really depends on how the software is being created, how the software is being consumed, and where the value is for both the project and the corporation that is consuming it.
This feels spreadsheetable. Like I throw my enterprise architect hat on. I whip out my software bill of materials software because we've all got one around now, right?
Got something now, yeah.
Log4j taught us. So I now take a look at what open source libraries is my organization dependent on? How are they dependent on it? And then I start building out a spreadsheet that says, how much do we value this? Could we replace it easily and so forth? And then do we have dev skills in this space? Are there features we'd want to build? Maybe it is worthwhile allocating a day a week or so of one of our people to work on that versus can I take this to the powers that be and get a budget and contribute a certain amount of cash?
Yep.
Knowing, and then also admitting that's probably going to have a little front of the line effect when you do push some issues in. Mm-hmm. As much as you're definitely making yourself a more equal pig at that moment when you are one of the few contributors. Like I would argue now is a great time to get a budget for this because A, it's a financially tough time, and B, most people aren't contributing. And so when you do want something, don't be surprised that you're probably going to get preferred experience.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you
I have not thought that way of like, all the tools are in place. You could lay out a spreadsheet to this and you could say for a reasonable amount of effort, we could look ourselves in the eye and say, we're supporting the open source that helps us succeed.
I know that Microsoft uses more than 40,000 different open source dependencies in the products that we build. I know they're used in 9.5 million places in our code base. Like I can come up with some of these statistics. I can tell you what the most requested packages are. Actually, I won't, but
So you've bombed Microsoft? How did you get that data together, Sarah? Like it's a big organization.
It's a great big organization. We actually do a lot of this work through our OSPO, where we make sure that we are understanding where our dependencies are, and we can tell you, which pieces of open source software we are dependent on. We can tell you when they were reviewed. We can tell you, what we are doing with them. It's imperfect as all data is, but we have a pretty good directional sense of this. And we have an open source project that tracks licenses. This is clearly defined so that we can then be able to do all of the compliance work around licenses.
Right.
I don't know if you heard that podcast we did with David Whitney back in November at NDC, but he brought up this idea that I think was one of the most electrifying ideas of the whole talk, which is to have the open source repository like GitHub, for example, implement some sort of monetization strategy so that for software developers, for providers to use, so that they can charge the end user for however they decide to do that for use of their software. And maybe it's in tiers. Maybe there's a free tier, and maybe there's another tier, and blah blah blah. But we were talking about having developers recouping their losses, and Richard was talking about tin cupping. This would be a way to sort of help developers fall in the pit of success for that. What do you think of that idea?
I think there exist a couple of things like that. So we've got, Buy Me a Coffee. We've got GitHub sponsors. Like in the industry, there are a few of those.
Those sound like tin cupping things, though, right? So I'm talking about going right to the end user. So let's say I have a piece of software for Windows. It's open source, but I want to be able to charge the user to unlock advanced features or whatever. And rather than putting anything in the source code that, I want to have, or maybe I just want to charge for it. No, I want to have GitHub charge the user or the developer.
That's GitHub sponsors, right?
Yeah.
I think that's GitHub sponsors. It's as close as I know, but I also don't make product calls for GitHub, and while this sounds super cool, I probably shouldn't commit anybody to do anything.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just trying to take the temperature.
You can. I don't think it'll happen that way, but you could.
Yeah,
I was just trying to take the temperature into what you thought of that idea.
Yeah, I think Sponsors does that fairly well. It's the you can pay me. There's not. I think what I'm seeing is the difference from what you're saying, though, is that this is not you can't use this unless, which is actually antithetical to the open source model.
Right.
Like, so that's the other problem that you run into is,
right.
We did not distribute binaries early on in open source, like 40 years ago, as this was like being created as the free software movement was happening and all of that. The idea was to teach more about the programming and less about using this software for free. But then it sort of has evolved to be using the software for free as a experience of this license, especially after binaries started being published under those licenses, in which case it ends up being something that is opposite of charging for that binary, becomes opposite of the license that you may have offered it under, which is kind of complicated.
Yeah, and we used to call software that, eventually demanded money from you crippleware, right? At some point, it would cripple itself because you hadn't paid.
Well, the examples that David brought up were interesting. There are stuff like, stuff that is open source that millions and millions of companies are making billions of dollars using, right?
Yep.
And hey, wouldn't it be nice to give some back to the developer for that, and just to be able to do that in a painless way.
And I think that's exactly what GitHub Sponsors about. Is that, you do that SBOM thing, you figure out these are the projects you depend on, you go find them on GitHub, and you put in a monthly contribution. Like the company could easily do that if we do the work.
Oh, okay. It sounds more like not a requirement, but an optional, sort of a Patreon.
It absolutely is.
It is optional.
Yeah. And I don't know there's any way to make it a requirement that's reasonable.
Yeah. Not while still having it exist under the, standard open source licenses.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, it sure sounded like a good idea at the time, didn't it?
Well, and it still is.
Like
it's just the enforcement creates more problems than it solves.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
I'm going to go back and listen to that show and make sure I
think there's a cultural shift
about.
Here, though, because the Linux Foundation, I think, has done well on this, right? That don't you have an array of routine contributors that support the foundation?
We have an array of routine contributors to the different projects. Some of them are employed by companies that support the Linux Foundation. Some of them still are doing their own work the way they would do open work in open source as well. You don't have to be a member of the Linux Foundation. The dues that go to the Linux Foundation directed funds are generally around advocacy and infrastructure, in order to support those projects, like advocating that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is the best place to go find, your cloud native computing needs and the ecosystem of tools, et cetera. But there's still not a lot of direct payment to developers from either the Linux Foundation or the subsidiaries. The Rust Foundation has been working on some of that sort of work. They've been doing more work with their fellowship program, where they're bringing in early in career contributors to the project, sponsoring them, and then helping them get placed in jobs for Rust after that time period, which I think is also a good way to look at this.
And I look at projects that this is in the Microsoft space, like Glimpse, right? So Anthony and Nick ultimately got hired by Microsoft.
Yeah.
Yep.
And for a while, were continuing to contribute to Glimpse while they worked for Microsoft, although I don't think either one of them does anymore. In some ways, Glimpse has sort of been put out to pasture, one would argue, because other things have taken the role that Glimpse was doing for client-side instrumentation on the web. But, James Newton King joining Microsoft, the guy who built the JSON libraries.
That works on gRPC
so good.
And everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it actually probably pretty hard to find Glimpse at this point.
Okay.
because it has, once upon a time they were regular guests on the show. There's the image editor type thing. This is the Glimpse, the browser instrumentation project.
Yeah. Well, what's next for you? What's in your inbox, Sarah?
I am very deeply invested in getting Microsoft to think about open source as building blocks as part of our software, which we should be paying for in some manner, whether that's through a program. So I'm working on this cost of goods theory. We do make contributions to foundations. We do have people who work on upstream projects. We do have, build our own projects, as I've said. So we kind of hit on all three of those types of projects that I was talking about. The one where you consume, or the ways you can work with open source, consuming it, contributing to it, or creating it. And so we do all three. I just think we should be doing all three a lot more, given the amount of just by raw line count, the amount that those building blocks are holding up the innovation that we're making today.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you've got an event coming up, Sarah, the Azure Open Source Day on March 7th.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it. It's a day full of panels and presentations and conversations about the open source work that is happening inside Microsoft and where we're working in open source adjacent to Microsoft, to the point that we had made about it being a fundamental building block in all of our tools. So we can talk a little bit about our Linux plans, more broadly our open source plans within Azure. Like, there's all sorts of good stuff coming up in that.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Well, I'll include a link in the show notes. Anybody wants to catch that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, because it will be a fun day.
Well, and thank you, Sarah, for joining us this hour. It's been great talking to you, and it's always good to talk about open source. We love it.
Call me anytime. This is what I do all day long, any day.
All right. You got it. And we'll talk to you, dear listener, next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time. Got transmitter bands by the FCC. Yes, I'm a